It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Arlington Park Bears don't have quite the same ring to it as the Chicago Bears, but a new stadium could be a game changer for the franchise. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Today's episode is brought to you by RockAuto.com. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. On the show today, all things Bears stadium talk, a bid to potentially purchase the Arlington Park racetrack, a potential move out of downtown Chicago into the suburbs, drawing some criticism from some fans and the mayor, big potential for a lot of great entertainment and a whole stadium complex in Arlington Park. We'll try and get a sense of what the proposals look like, how this process works, some of the local politics behind it, and what all of this could mean for the future of the Chicago Bears. This had sort of been building up over really a long time, but the last few months in particular, the rumors had started, right? It started off as just kind of little report here and there, not anything that had a ton of legs in terms of like a big name media report coming out about it. But then all of a sudden, late last week, George McCaskey and the Chicago Bears formally announce that they put in a bid for the Arlington Park Stadium. The statement from Ted Phillips said, "We recently submitted a bid to purchase the Arlington International Racecourse property. It's our obligation to explore every possible option to ensure we're doing what's best for our organization and its future. If selected, this step allows us to further evaluate the property and its potential." That statement again from Chicago Bears team president Ted Phillips. And you can see the attraction there, right? It's 326 acres. It's the kind of thing the Bears have been interested in for a long time. It would be more than enough space to build a state-of-the-art facility and probably a lot more. And we'll get into some of what that a lot more could look like here a little bit later on in the podcast. But we know this is something that's been part of this Bears franchise discussion for a long time. I think it really picked up the most like late 80s, early 90s. To be honest with you, it's before my time, before I was actually alive. But looking back over some of the history of how this has gone, you know, there was sort of this back and forth. I think George Halas was the first one who was interested in 1975. He went to some Chamber of Commerce meeting or whatever. You know, you start playing the local politics game a little bit and schmoozing around and figuring out where might be the right location for the team. And then, you know, all into the 90s, they kind of have this back and forth talk. Eventually, instead, they get really nice renovations for Soldier Field in the early 2000s. And now we're sort of coming up again on a question of where the future of this franchise might lay. As of now, the Bears still are under a lease at Soldier Field through 2033. So it's important to keep in perspective here what the timeline is. It's not like next year they're going to put a shovel in the dirt or anything like that. All that happened is the owner of the Arlington Park racetrack put out essentially what's a request for bids. They said, you know what, we're interested in potentially selling this property. Let's see what different organizations and proposals we could get in this process. What kind of dollars could come for prime real estate and a very large facility and a large area around the facility. And so the Bears are one of the teams, and one of the organizations, I should say, that submitted a bid. It's not like a auction bidding process, right? Where one organization says $100 million and then someone's 150 and it's going once, going twice. There's no auctioneer in this type of a process. It's more of a silent bid submission where a number of organizations, and we don't know what that number of organizations is, but a few of them have submitted their proposals. So it's not just a dollar amount. It's not just saying, well, I can pay more than anyone else, but it's a combination of here's how much I will pay for it, and here's what I will do with that plan if I am awarded that bid. Because the property owner, as they try and select a potential bid that they like, they also have other interests besides purely financial. They want to see the property succeed in whatever its next venture might be. And there's always individual priorities. Maybe the owners want to see some sort of racetrack presence still there. Maybe that's important to them. I mean, we don't know what exactly their thought process is, but we do know there have been at least 2 publicly announced bids. One is, of course, the Bears. Another is an organization that would want to keep the racetrack going there and have some sort of larger horse racing presence. I believe it was the mayor of Arlington Heights has said there's a couple more, and that of course it's all private for the company that's selling the property. The property owner doesn't have to, like, at this stage, release a full list of everything. It's just the Bears happen to have publicly stated this is part of their plans. I think in some part because it was already getting out to the media and there were already going to be reports. So it's kind of up to the Bears to get out in front of that and not let the speculation run rampant. The problem is speculation has continued to run fairly rampant, and it's starting to become a political battle because the Bears are also currently in negotiations to renovate Soldier Field, to upgrade some of its facilities and try and make it an overall better facility. And those negotiations come with the city of Chicago and the Chicago Parks Department. So when news of them potentially leaving comes out, all of a sudden it's of severe interest to the city of Chicago, and particularly the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who put out a statement right after the news came out that went viral and had Bears fans up in arms, had the city of Chicago buzzing about it, really had the sports world talking about what the mayor had said, firing back against the Chicago Bears. We'll dive into a little bit of her statement and some of the just real questionable decisions that went into that, including typos and just the thought process doesn't seem to be fully fleshed out there. Next on Locked On Bears. Today's podcast brought to you by our friends at BetOnline.ag. It is the number one place to lay your sports bets down, and it's the number one place we recommend. Just because we're in late June doesn't mean you can't find NFL bets, everything Chicago Bears related. Trips to the Super Bowl, win total over under 7.5. Bears are currently underdogs to make the playoffs. You can bet on their week 1 game against the Los Angeles Rams. You can bet on Matt Nagy as coach of the year, as potentially first coach fired, Justin Fields offensive rookie of the year, and so much more. So head on over to betonline.ag and sign up for a free account today. Enter our promo code LOCKEDON, and you'll receive a free 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. So Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot inserts herself into this public discussion of the Bears stadium. And I suppose it was necessary, right? I mean, this is of significant importance to her city and the people that elected her to lead that city. And of course, if I was in charge of Chicago, I would want the Bears to stay by all means. But I don't know that this is exactly how I would go about making that decision. Here's the statement that Lori Lightfoot put out. Quote, "Our city is home to some of the world's finest sports teams who have played a vital role in the city's reopening. As part of the city's recovery, many organizations are doubling down on their commitment to Chicago, and we expect the Chicago Bears to follow suit. The Bears are locked into a lease at Soldier Field until 2033. In addition, this announcement from the Bears comes in the midst of negotiations for improvements at Soldier Field. This is clearly a negotiating tactic that the Bears have used before. As a season ticket holder and longtime Bears fan, I am committed to keeping the Chicago name in our football team. And like most Bears fans, we want the organization to focus on putting a winning team on the field, beating the Packers finally, and being relevant past October. Everything else is noise." Bold, to say the least, from Mayor Lightfoot, and questionable, to say a bit more. For me, it comes off as a really bad look for a couple of reasons. First of all, in the first version that she put out, and she deleted the first tweet that she put out and put out a second tweet, it was virtually the same statement. But in the first statement, whoever typed up the graphic that they put on social media spelled soldier wrong the first time in the word Soldier Field. So it said Soldier Field, Soldier, Soldier Field, or Solider Field. I mean, it was in the I was in the wrong spot. I can't remember exactly where it was. I think I just spelled it right when I said it there, but Solider, Solider Field. Regardless, when you're putting out a statement as, I don't want to say inflammatory, but clearly going up to battle, right? I mean, she's stepping into this fight and has something to stand for in this. When you go to that spot, you got to make sure you've got literally your T's crossed and your I's dotted. I suppose the I was dotted. It was just dotted in the wrong part of the word. And so that was the first bad look. Of course, the second bad look, talking trash about the team in the same statement as you're complimenting the team for all of that. I mean, you're trying to say we value the Chicago Bears, and yet as we look at the statement, right, we expect the Chicago Bears to follow through. We want them to double down on their commitment to Chicago as a, what did she say? As a season ticket holder and lifelong Bears fan, right? She's trying to say, hey, we love this team and we want the team to be here. And then they need to focus on putting a winning team on the field and beating the Packers finally. I mean, that's the word. Finally, and being relevant past October is just completely unnecessary in this statement from the mayor, right? You can say pretty much everything before that, right? You can say, we want the Bears to be here. We want them to help us in the recovery of the city. They're in a lease with us and they're in negotiations. And we do see this as a negotiating tactic. I'm fine with calling that out as a negotiating tactic and saying, yeah, you know what? We've heard this before. George Halas did this in the 70s and they did this in the 80s and in the 90s and early 2000s until they got their renovations last time. Okay, that's fine. But where you cross the line and where it goes from a mayor standing up for a city to a poor public relations decision is blatantly criticizing the team for their on-field performance, right? This changing stadiums has nothing to do with focusing on winning, right? I mean, Ted Phillips and the business side of the organization handle the stadium stuff. Ryan Pace, I mean, I guess he was a little bit involved with the Halas Hall stuff, and they would have some say over the facilities and what they want there. But Matt Nagy's not doing anything with that. The quarterbacks, scouting isn't affected by any of that. Moving stadiums has nothing to do with how they're performing on the field. I mean, you could argue that maybe they could perform on the field better in a new stadium if it had better facilities and more space and more fans seating and all those different things, maybe a dome. I mean, we'll get into some of those potential dynamics here a little bit later on in the podcast, but it's a poor taste. Like, she's trying to take some of the leverage back, but the Bears have all the leverage here, right? Chicago needs the Bears a lot more than the Bears need Chicago. The Bears can play in Arlington Heights, and Bears fans are still going to go there. I mean, as much as we could be mad and you wouldn't, fans would be upset, and maybe some would boycott, but it's the NFL and it's a major media market. And again, we'll get into some of the potential impacts of moving, but it's like the Bears have the leverage here 100%. And she's trying to take some of that leverage back by saying, well, focus on some of this other stuff and stick to your lease, and trying to kind of paint them into a bad light, but paint them into a bad light from the business side about the lease and negotiating tactics. Don't paint them in a bad light about how they've performed on the field, because that just puts everyone off to you. Like if I'm the mayor, the people that voted for me are going to be off put by that. Like you want to stand up for your city and what's best for the city, and trying to keep the team here is what's best for the city. But who does it benefit? How does it benefit her? How does it benefit anybody to say beat the Packers finally and be relevant past October, even though they've been in the playoffs 2 of the last 3 years? I mean, you can make the Packers argument, and we're not trying to get into a football debate with the mayor, like X's and O's here, right? But it's unnecessary. It's not harmful per se, but maybe it's harmful for her and her reelection in the future and her approval ratings and all the different sort of political things that go there. But there's a line there that was crossed, and again, just comes off as completely unnecessary, maybe desperate a little bit from the mayor, desperate to try and keep this team here. Because when you start to dig down into it, you can find some real value in Arlington Park, and you can see why, if you're the Bears, it feels like more than just a negotiating tactic. Like, there's a legitimate draw to Arlington Park here, and this situation and the idea of having a new stadium that is more than just trying to get the city to give you a better deal on renovations. I mean, there's definitely an aspect to that, but I think it can kind of have both impacts. It can be a legitimate exploration of a new stadium location, while also maybe giving you even more leverage in negotiations with the city. We'll take a look at what Arlington Park could hold for these Bears and what a stadium would do for this franchise next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode brought to you by our great friends at Built Bar. I had a Built Bar right before I started recording this podcast, and it gives me just that sort of like sweet, delicious treat, but it's still good for me. That's why they truly are the best tasting protein bars ever, because they don't taste like protein bars. They're all covered in 100% real chocolate. They're soft and they're chewy, but they're high protein, high fiber, low sugar, and low calories. Up to this point, I have tried every single flavor that they have, and I haven't had a single bad one. I just placed a reorder for a full box of salted caramel, and for me, salted caramel tastes like a Milky Way. But again, it's not loaded up with that high fructose corn syrup and all that other junk I don't need. I'm telling you, Built Bars are the truth. You got to try them for yourself. Go to BuiltBar.com and use our promo code LOCKED15, and you'll get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. I understand with stadium negotiations and all this, there's a lot of moving parts. And no one knows more about moving parts than our friends at RockAuto.com. They're an online auto parts company that have been serving customers for over 20 years. They have everything you could possibly need for your vehicle. Fuel pump assemblies and engine control modules to the easy stuff like brake parts and tail lamps and motor oil. And it's all delivered right to your door in just a few easy clicks. You don't have to go to the auto parts store where they're not going to have the parts you need and they're just going to have to order it for you anyway. You have to answer all their line of questioning. No, rockauto.com, you just enter in your car's make and model and quickly pull up all the different parts for your vehicle and choose between the brands, specifications, and prices you prefer. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So a Bears stadium in Arlington Park certainly wouldn't want to change the name of the team, right? They could still be the Chicago Bears, just kind of in Arlington Park. You think about how the Dallas Cowboys don't really play in Dallas. The Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, they're still the LA Angels. I mean, we've seen this across sports. The basketball teams, the New York Nets and the Brooklyn Nets, and of course the Giants play in East Rutherford, New Jersey with the Jets. I mean, the city name is more about the proximity. And I know in the past, like in the 80s and 90s when the Bears threatened to leave Chicago, I think the Chicago mayor said this team will no longer be called the Chicago Bears if they move while I'm still in office. And maybe Lori Lightfoot could play that game. But it's such an intriguing draw for the team. And I completely understand from a fan base perspective why you wouldn't want the Bears to leave Chicago, right? You don't want them outside of your city. You want them to be right there. You want them to be a part of that downtown ecosystem, right up on the lake down there. It's a beautiful view in the park area around there. I mean, there's so much to love about Soldier Field, and there's so much history in Soldier Field. Of course, the whole soldier aspect, the memorial to the fallen soldiers in the military, right? There's a great draw to Soldier Field, and I don't want to ignore or write off or put off any of that or minimize any of that. It's a great thing, but it's also the smallest stadium in the NFL in terms of seats. It's old. It is in need of some renovations. It's lacking compared to some of their other counterparts, and the potential of what you could build on such a site in Arlington Park with the right funding is really pretty potentially exciting, right? You could do a whole entertainment district. It's one of the proposals that's been out there, is that maybe the Bears bid could work and partner with one of the horse racing bids and do both. Like you would build Soldier Field on one part, you would have the horse race track on another part, and sort of like in between, it'd be this whole entertainment district where maybe you have smaller venues and you have, of course, restaurants and maybe shops and almost like a mini city of sorts. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities here and for how this could work. And you could see where You could start to share some of the cost on some of these things if these groups work together. And it would really just be a great thing for Arlington Park, but it'd be a great thing for fans to be able to come to. And you could see where for fans that don't live in like Chicago proper, even though anyone from anywhere in the suburbs still says they're from Chicago when they leave Chicago. Oh yeah, I'm from Chicago, even if you're in like Schaumburg, like way out of the city, right? But fans from the rest of the state and coming over from Indiana perhaps and the region might have a slightly easier time getting at it there in Arlington Park, not having to go through, the downtown and parking and all that stuff. Like there's a give and take there. Like I know the owner of a couple minor league baseball teams, Quint Studer, he owns the Pensacola Blue Wahoos and the Beloit Snappers, and he's built a couple of stadiums before, and I've interviewed him for other things, and he talks about how the value of having a downtown stadium in particular draws people downtown, right? It forces them, like, well, they're there, they'll eat at your restaurants, they'll stay at your hotels, whereas if it's outside of the downtown, especially if it's just right off a highway, people just kind of come in, go to the game, and then leave and never really interact with your city, and you get less of an economic impact. So, right, I understand all of that. But for the Bears, a new stadium, first of all, could mean a Super Bowl. Every time a team builds the new stadium, the NFL generally sort of unofficially gives them a Super Bowl, right? It's not necessarily written into the contract as far as I know, but it's considered a thank you Super Bowl. Thank you for building the stadium. We will let you host a Super Bowl in the near future. Can you imagine Super Bowl Chicago, how much fun that would be? Even though it's in Arlington Park, still Super Bowl in Chicago would be incredible. And I've seen other people say that Chicago is a big enough market where if the stadium had a dome, which is another potential sticking point for Bears fans, but if it had a dome and you could go indoors, that maybe the Bears could get multiple Super Bowls. And it wouldn't just be a one-off thing. It would be, it would be a rotation with all of the other teams, but like, it's more than what the Vikings or the Colts got. When they built their stadiums, they got Super Bowls, but the NFL hasn't really been back because it's not quite the draw that a brand new Chicago stadium could be. Because right now with the Bears, you can only renovate so much, right? As much as they're in the market for Soldier Field renovations, you can't put that much more seating in there, right? You can't just crack open the bowl of the stadium and expand it, right? It doesn't work like that. You'd have to demolish the whole building and build a new one if you wanted to have even more seating and get even more fans in there. Like, kudos to the Park District for finally kind of fixing the Bears field. It hasn't been nearly as big of an issue the last few years after they changed the way they do the grass. I'm not an expert on all that, but something with the turf has improved drastically where it's not as big of a problem for the Bears and their opponents. Wind obviously still a factor at Soldier Field. If you made it a dome, you'd lose some of that. And there's some charm to that and some pride perhaps for the Bears, but that might be worth it if you get to host Super Bowls and have a state-of-the-art facility and maybe, just maybe, better conditions for your players. Maybe it makes them, a half or a whole 1% better of a team. I mean, it's a competitive advantage to have a really nice stadium with top-of-the-line facilities. Not that the Bears facilities are awful and holding the team back by any means, but it's something that can be better. And again, if the money is there, which could require public funding, which means raise taxes, which is a whole other debate that is a whole podcast. And honestly, at that point, it's not even a sports podcast. It's a political podcast and a financial podcast and an economics podcast that I'm not as particularly interested in spending a whole lot of time on. Generally speaking, teams have a ton of leverage in there to kind of squeeze the cities and the taxpayers for as much as they want. And it's worth it for a lot of fans to be able to still have that team there if they're risking losing the team. But again, promise, I'm trying not to get into it. I caught myself there. I was starting to get into it. We're going to leave that for another podcast. But it's an exciting potential development for the Bears. I understand mixed feelings of them potentially leaving, potentially staying there. There's a lot of draw in either direction. And it's the kind of thing that, again, we're looking at a decade away. Maybe not even Justin Fields' career as a Bears player. Maybe not, Cole Kmet grew up in Arlington Park and he tweeted about how it'd be cool to play in his own backyard. But I don't know that the stadium would be purchased and built and done and ready to go by the time Cole Kmet's still a Chicago Bear. I mean, we're getting way down the line in the career here, but it's going to be really fun to watch. We're going to be keeping up with any and all developments on the stadium front right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure that you subscribe to keep up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Those of you following along on YouTube can see this is our first YouTube full video podcast. So the podcast will be available everywhere you normally get it. It's available there right now if you're listening on the podcast forum later on, but It is in video. I am on camera on YouTube for the first time, giving you a visual look at this podcast. I think a little rough around the edges. Maybe you can hear a slight difference. I'm trying to keep it as streamlined and as seamless as possible, but it's an adjustment to be on camera, a little bit harder to fix mistakes. You kind of just have to roll with it as though you are live, but that's going to be our plan moving forward. So please check out our YouTube channel, Locked On Bears. We're going to have a ton of great video content for you there. Please like our videos, comment on our videos, watch them all the way through. Those are the things that really help us grow as a podcast and as a YouTube channel. It's how we reach more Bears fans just like you and help everyone bear down.